theology. That was a lot of fun. And obviously, I marked a lot of stuff back then. And so that's why I went and got the paper edition, so that I could get to my markings in the text that I used, which was the older text. This is sort of what's been available for a long time. This is Lightfoot and Harmer's edition of the Apostolic Fathers, and it's still available too. And so you've got the martyrdom of Polycarp and all sorts of other neat stuff in here. And once we get done with Clement and the Didache, we'll look at Ignatius. I'll read you the martyrdom of Ignatius and stuff like that. I think it's important that you're familiar with these things. I haven't just heard about them, but actually, get a chance to read them and know something about them. I think it helps out a lot. One of the things now Clement of Rome. Well, yeah, that's the traditional authorship, but we don't know who wrote it. If it was Clement, this is extremely important. This is one point where sometimes people tune out, but tune in here for a second. This is a letter from the church at Rome to the church at Corinth, rebuking them for having driven their elders out. There was a church split, and enough people were involved in it that they were able to remove the properly instituted leadership of the church. Now, what's important to recognize is the letter is very clear. It was elders, not a bishop, elders. Now, why is that significant? Well, hopefully it's obvious why that's significant. It's significant because we have to ask ourselves the question, what did the church look like during a period of time where the Apostle John may still have been alive or had only recently passed? Was the church looking to the successors of Peter to lead the church? And the fact of the matter is, there's not a scintilla of evidence that's the case. This is one of the great failures of the modern Roman Catholic historical effort to substantiate the papacy. Some of you have heard of a man by the name of Cardinal Newman. He was an Anglican that converted to Roman Catholicism and came up with what's called the development hypothesis, that divine truth is like the acorn to the oak tree. It's given in a small form that develops over time. And this is his way of getting around the fact that the early church did not look like modern Roman Catholicism. There was no pope, there were no cardinals, there were no 7 sacraments, etc., etc. But he is the one who is responsible for a phrase that you hear over and over today. And in fact, it was repeated a number of times in a book called Evangelical Exodus, which was the stories of 9 people who were graduates, and some had taught on the staff of Southern Evangelical Seminary in Charlotte, North Carolina. And if you're familiar with Southern Evangelical Seminary, then you know it was founded by Norman Geisler, and that they are famous for being, well, the patron saint is Thomas Aquinas. They are wedded to Thomas Aquinas, and the problem is Thomas Aquinas was a full-blown Roman Catholic. And they're into him for philosophical reasons, but it's sort of hard to separate the philosophy and the theology. They're very anti-reform. They're against the Reformation. So it's not overly shocking that 24 people, graduates and staff people of that church, of that seminary, have, since its founding, become Roman Catholics. It's just sort of like, well, duh. But they can't see the duh part for some reason. And so some of these people got together and wrote a book about why they became Roman Catholics and how SES was a major part of this. Well, one of the primary issues, of course, has to do with the authority of the Roman bishop. And the phrase that appeared a bunch of times in that book, and it comes from John Henry Cardinal Newman, was to go deep into history is to cease to be Protestant. To go deep into history is to cease to be Protestant. Now, what has always made me chuckle about that is that John Henry Cardinal Newman lived in the years right before 1870. Anybody know what happened in 1870? Yes, sir, you can say that louder than that if you'd like. First Vatican Council takes place in 1870. What's defined as the First Vatican Council? Papal infallibility. In the years before that council, there was great debate on the subject. And John Henry Cardinal Newman was one of the primary people that argued against the idea of papal infallibility because he knew that historically speaking, it was absurd to assert that this was the faith of the ancient church. Nobody at the Council of Nicaea, the first great ecumenical council, had any inkling of the idea that all they needed to do was just ask the Bishop of Rome. And since he's the infallible head of the church, he could have defined all this stuff for us. Why bother with all these councils then? I don't get it. Nobody back then had any idea of this. And so it's funny that these converts would be quoting John Henry Cardinal Newman because Newman argues against it. Then when it's defined, all of a sudden he shuts up. So I guess to go deep into history is to shut up once Rome tells you to, which is sort of not the same thing that they're trying to communicate with their particular apologetic they're using today. Well, why is this relevant to our studies? Well, obviously, some Roman Catholics would say, well, here, in the first writing outside the New Testament, the church at Rome is showing its authority. The bishop of the Church of Rome, Clement, is writing to the Corinthians and saying, you put those people back, we're in charge. And there are lots of folks, lots of young hotheads out of the University of Steubenville and places like that that'll tell you that's exactly what this epistle is all about. Well, that's not what the epistle is all about. If someone tells you that, they're demonstrating they actually haven't read it. It never names the author. And it recognizes that the church at Corinth had a different form of church government than one bishop over the church. It had a plurality of elders, because it always refers to the elders in plural. What's even more important is that all the evidence points out, and keep this in mind if you're taking notes, that up to 140 or 150 AD, the church at Rome likewise had a plurality of elders and did not have but one bishop. Now that's extremely important because if Rome was allegedly founded by Peter, and there's